on the phone Nikil Saval. He's the editor of N+1 magazine and author of Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace. Thanks so much for joining us, Nikil.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start. I want to get into the history of the workplace, but you had written in the in Cube's introduction that you were inspired by the book White Collar by C. Wright Mills. I'm not terribly familiar with that book, but tell us what it was about that book that led you to write Cubed.
Oh, well, White Collar is sort of a classic of American sociology, and maybe C. Wright Mills is maybe his best book. It came out in the 1950s, and at that time, Mills was among the first to observe that white-collar workers in the United States were on pace to exceed the number of blue-collar workers and basically make the United States a kind of white-collar nation. And so he wanted to examine what it meant for the U.S. And this was broadly true for other countries and what advanced capitalist countries in the rest of the world. What this meant for its social consequences, cultural consequences, what kind of political formations these white-collar workers would have, and what it meant for the United States to have this different kind of middle class. Very different from the heavily industrialized working class of the early 20th century that made up the backbone of the country. And he was pretty scathing. I mean, it was the kind of amazing thing about it was just to look back and just to, especially in a nation that is much more officed, much more characterized by white-collar work, to see how much he thought that this was a group that was largely spineless, that didn't have any kind of independent political agency, kind of was more likely to follow other people. He pointed out a lot of things about how the nation was becoming more the workplace was more psychologized. White-collar work is really heavily dependent on how you perceive others to perceive yourselves. There's, of course, the notion of office politics, like the way just little petty resentments and games and backstabbing characterize office work more than in other workplaces. So all this stuff he examined, and it remained the only comprehensive book about the topic for years. And people wrote sort of more specialized studies about architecture or about management or what have you, but no one really attempted such a synoptic portrait of white-collar work, and that was now 60 years ago. So I felt like there was a sort of, I couldn't hope to compete with his sort of power of analysis, but I thought there was sort of more to say as what's happened in the intervening 50 years.
And like I said, I want to go back through the history of the development of that workspace, but how much through it was this? How much of the development of the workspace through the years was a function of sort of, I guess, of putting white-collar workers in an environment where they would be isolated from where they are in the greater sense of labor, I guess?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's changed over the years. I think but if you look back at the earliest white-collar workplaces, or the first moment when people start to call sort of office workplaces offices. Before they were called counting houses, they were called various things, but the office is a particular place. It does coincide roughly with the separation of white-collar work from blue-collar work. So there was always this sense that office work, since its origins in the antebellum era, was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be elevated. It was dignified. It was clean work. It was business. It was upwardly mobile in a way that blue-collar work wasn't. And so there was a kind of visual separation in a lot of offices. They would be crowned with sort of Greek revival architecture. The workplaces often looked more noble than factory work. And this only increased in the late 19th, early 20th century when business became big business, and it became at once easier to separate offices. I mean, it's just technologically easier with telegraph communications, telephones, things like that, the railroad. And then also the office work staff became much more bureaucratized. It became, in its way, it began to resemble factory work more broadly, but was usually separated from it. So a kind of classic instance of this is the Pullman Company in Chicago in the 19th century. You know, Pullman famously was one of the first company towns in the United States. The factory workers who ran the Pullman cars on trains, and they had a huge strike in the 19th century. But actually, the office staff was not participant in this. They had this separate kind of company town in a skyscraper in Chicago, which was really cushy. It had all sorts of amenities, the kinds of amenities we associate with places like Google and places like that now. And that separation, you know, was often enforced in cities. I mean, factories would be in Chicago again. We're sort of on the periphery of the city, and the white-collar offices downtown. And a lot of that was to ensure that white-collar workers were not contaminated with the kind of labor menace that was taking factories. I mean, it's important to point out that it wasn't just that there was a kind of conspiracy to do this. White-collar workers often accepted or consented to this arrangement. They did, in their own terms, express the notion that their work was meant to be kind of middle class. And so that was often the case. So it wasn't just a kind of the hegemony of the management. It was the two kind of groups work together.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, you know, when we get up to 1950, you know, how much sort of Taft-Hartley had to do with sort of creating that us and them type of dynamic. But let's go back to where where we track the beginning of the origins of the office. Is it around Pullman? And what happens from there?
Oh yeah, so around that time like Chicago is a good example. Pullman's just a kind of specific example, but a lot of those companies separate their office work staff from their blue-collar staff. And then in turn, you know, over the early 20th century, you have the rise of scientific management. Frederick Taylor, in particular, who is chiefly remembered for his work on the shop floor and his attempts to monitor and motion study workers and find the one best way to have the most efficient, standardized work staff. But then they also turn what that has two effects. One is to increase the management hierarchy, so you actually load up the number of workers who are kind of monitoring and surveilling the workers in the factories. And then in turn, these workers become subject to surveillance. So you have these very comic attempts to motion study envelope licking, to motion study the fastest way to file, things like that. And the office becomes regimented and more organized along the lines of factory labor. So that's sort of where things start to turn in the early 20th century, and there's pushback against this, especially in the 1930s, when the kind of plausibility of upward mobility in the office is seriously compromised. And so you have a lot more office worker organizing. On the left, you have the left, which was actually for a while sort of just content to think of office workers as plagued by false consciousness. They start to realize that office workers can really be organized. There is a graphic novel that comes out in the 40s called White Collar, about how white-collar workers are learning to march alongside their blue-collar brethren. So it becomes this big united front of office workers, or at least that's the dream. And some of it actually comes true. And that sort of takes you up to the post-war era, when labor's successes become challenged, I guess, by Taft-Hartley.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Taylor. I mean, was it how much of his push for efficiency, how much did it take into account sort of, what could be problematic when worker A starts talking to worker B about what's going on here?
Well, Taylor took into he did have a very anti-union bias. I mean, it was meant to isolate and individualize workers and make them more competitive with each other. The introduction of the piece rate system, where you would be, and the notion that you would really be paid, you would be competing with other workers for higher pay rather than being offered the same salary. That was meant to break any nascent notion of solidarity. It was meant to make workers, think of themselves as individuals and meritocrats in a way, and responsible for their own rise. So that was the attempt that that was the ideology behind it. And his acolytes who worked in the office workplace felt that the office was even more susceptible to this kind of appeal, that the office was the height of American individualism, that people really thought of themselves as responsible for themselves in some ways, and not prone to organizing or banding together. So there was certainly a lot of that in the Taylorist ideal, the notion that management had the best way to teach you how to rise up. I mean, people did resist that. Taylor was not very acute in his psychological reasoning, and so there were attempts to moderate it, to make it more, the introductions of Freudianism into the workplace, to make workers feel more at home, to feel that their workplaces were familial. That ends up happening later, but the basic gist stayed the same: the notion that workers were alone and responsible for themselves.
And let's talk about at what point too that women are brought into the office. There was one fact that you had talked about, that there was actually like a ceiling placed on what women could earn at that time.
Yeah, which was, in fact, I mean, that was just taken for granted. The notion that women it was not even plausible to, and this of course remained true for generations, but it was not even plausible that women would earn as much as men. And in a way, this eased the notion that they could be slotted into the most menial occupations. I mean, women, when they entered the workplace, the office workplace, were usually given the jobs in the typing pool. They were stenographers, the kind of lightly mechanical, monotonous, more factory-like jobs. The exception to that was the position of secretary. So there was this kind of division even among women, between the prestigious and less prestigious occupations. Because if you were a secretary, you had a kind of personal relationship to invariably a male boss, and if you derived some prestige from working for a especially powerful or rich boss, people often referred to secretaries as office wives, because they saw their bosses more than their bosses' wives saw them. And they were expected to, as is well known in popular culture, they were expected to handle their dry cleaning, just be their unofficial therapist, and without any sort of conception of sexual harassment or any of those laws for many years. That was something that women were just expected to deal with, to kind of fend off, at the same time that they had no recourse when it came to a boss who kept making overtures of that kind. So that was the sort of position that women held, at the same time that none of these occupations were ever going to pay very well. Women at some point were expected to get married and leave the office workplace. And even when they did get married, sometimes they were fired as a result. I mean, there was no notion that they would continue to work after they had been married.
And then talk a little bit about the change to architecture. You mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright's building in Buffalo. I guess in the first couple of years of the 20th century. What was that an attempt to do, and what did it end up doing?
Oh yeah, so Wright's building, the Larkin building in Buffalo, was it was an attempt in some ways to harmonize all the kind of conflicting impulses of the workplace at that time. I mean, one was that efficiency and the smooth factory-like flow of paperwork was essential to office work. The Larkin Company was a mail order company. I mean, I guess if we were looking for a contemporary example, it would be Amazon. I mean, because initially they sold soap products, but then over time they just sold anything that could be packaged, just as Amazon initially sold books and has moved on. But they they had a lot of paperwork to process, a lot of phone calls, a lot of orders, and so it was a very tough operation to manage. The other thing that they had to manage was the fact that there was a kind of notion that workers still needed welfare, they still needed play, they still needed to be, they couldn't do this all the time. They had to feel that their company cared for them. So the Larkin building had both impulses in play. I mean, one, Wright designed this building that had this very smooth flow of paperwork that actually, if you look at the plans, flows in a kind of spiral downwards, where the orders get received up top and then eventually get processed, and it looks a lot like the Guggenheim building in New York. So it was a really complex and impressive system of work. At the same time that he wanted the workers to feel ennobled by the workspace. So there was a central light court that was 5 stories tall. Is really quite, I mean, genuinely beautiful. In photographs, the building is demolished, so we don't see it anymore. But that was meant to, and it had slogans on the wall of instructing workers that their work was ennobling, that the spirit of self-sacrifice was important for work, and so that was part of its atmosphere. It had a kind of rudimentary form of air conditioning, well before the air conditioning that we know came into being. It was just the air, because Buffalo was largely a smokestack town, and it wanted to keep the workers inside, cool, and also the air healthy. So that was part of it. And then it had there were company picnics. The whole notion of it being a family was part of the atmosphere. The idea being that workers were supposed to really identify with their company and not really feel badly about it. And that ethos of a company that works you really hard, but then takes care of you, has been a constant in so-called progressive companies over the 20th century.
I mean, that feels like that lasted through, I guess, maybe through the 60s and the 70s to a certain extent. Like, this is going to be my adult life. This is my new family. I mean, you also mentioned, too, that building was designed to be for easy sort of surveillance on the workers, I guess, as they look down upon them. But let's jump back up to the 50s. I mean, did that distinction between those who were sort of, I guess, considered managers as opposed to those who worked, did that have any implications for the office when via Taft-Hartley, or was that Taft-Hartley was sort of a result of that culture already sort of having been groomed, I guess?
Oh yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and actually, this is a topic of some debate, but it is. I think the Taft-Hartley did put the seal on the notion that on a long attempt to figure out to distinguish between the employee and the worker and the manager. There's some scholarship on this, but it did divide the people who were subject to organization and the people who weren't. I think it did. I think it was a kind of process. It didn't establish a totally new paradigm, but it did kind of seal the lid on, for a while, on the notion that salaried employees or whatever were of common cause with blue collar workers. I mean, you've seen. I mean, one sees this even as recently as the UAW vote in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where salaried employees actually could campaign against the union. Whereas so there was the blue collar union. So there was that divide that it's been ongoing. The kind of exception to all this was the public sector, where white-collar workers were allowed to organize and did in fact organize en masse. So Taft-Hartley had an effect, and a kind of chilling effect, but I don't think it was the central. It was a kind of culmination of decades of thinking on the topic.
And then the next big, I guess, advance or attempted advance in the workspace comes with the action office. Tell us what that attempt was.
So the action office was, it came out in there were two attempts, but the relevant one came out in the 1960s, late 1960s, and it was, it was an attempt to give workers in the center of an office basically some semblance of privacy. It was this sort of three-walled, hinged, flexible space invented by this designer working for Herman Miller named Robert Probst. And you have to think about the context in which it appeared. Up until the 1960s, most offices looked like, if you've seen Mad Men or if you've seen the film The Apartment, there's a center typing pool of desks that's just arranged in rows because it was assumed to be kind of factory-like work, and then offices around the corridor for middle and managers and executives, and then more executives on upper floors. And those were arranged by, they had certain status privileges. Like you might have an oak desk if you were a middle manager, a larger office, and a mahogany desk if you were an upper level manager, etc. And Probst thought, inspired by other kinds of, at the time, somewhat progressive anthropology and psychology, thought people just needed space that was more suited to work. It was more suited to what they needed to do rather than what kind of privilege they had earned on the company ladder. And so the action office was this kind of semi-autonomous, semi-private space that was meant for this particular kind of worker whom at the time, and this was a new term, he called knowledge workers. And it was a really big hit when it came out in 1968. No one had ever seen anything like this. People thought it was a really new conception of what office work could look like. And people began to copy it, a lot of the major furniture companies, and they would install lots of them. And, a lot of the kind of progressive thinking or supposedly progressive thinking that Probst had invested his design with slowly started to seep out of the plans. I mean, you have designers installing packs of these action office-like systems, and they come out and they look like these tall boxes. And it was and then they realized, it was at this time that the action office acquired the name that it's had ever since, which is the cubicle. And it became this kind of Frankenstein monster that just took over the office, just sort of infinitely replicable, colorless, gray, arbitrary, callous environment that took over the office. And in a way, it wasn't just that the design was bad that made it so loathed in the minds of American workers, but the fact that it took over precisely at the time that the whole notion of one's career and what work should be changed in the 1980s. The deregulation, the kind of introduction of layoffs and mass layoffs, all of these things came about at the same time that the cubicle was taking over. So the cubicle became this symbol of a kind of calloused, transfigured workplace of the kind of Reagan era or the early 1990s, the era of just constant recessions and layoffs and things like that.
What I thought was interesting is that Probst had designed it to be not at 90-degree angles, right? He had designed it to be at 120-degree angles, so they would sort of flare out.
Yeah, he had. Oh, that's right. Yeah, well, because he thought that workers in general were just going to have the capacity to rearrange what they were doing themselves, and it was meant to be more open. You look at pictures of it, and it seems like it's meant to be this really dynamic, flexible space. It's not the image we have of being stuck at a computer in a box and just being chained to it. I mean, Probst did kind of fall victim to the personal computer. That had not existed. He assumed that he meant action in action office. Like, it really meant he had images of people standing a lot and walking around. I mean, it was just a much more fluid fluid thing, but it just was much cheaper and quicker to turn it into the box that we know.
And so after we have this sort of new phenomena in the '80s where people realize, like, I'm not going to be at this company for 20 or 30 years. I'm not going to be a company man. What starts to happen in the '90s with, I mean, and how much was that? Did that play out in the sort of the design of the office? This notion of, like, I'm no longer an IBM guy.
Yeah, I mean that was that sort of change in one's relationship to one's company. I think really became most apparent in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s, in the first .com bubble. You have a lot of employees who come out of places like Intel or IBM or Microsoft, and these are companies. I mean, Intel was actually the first to introduce a kind of all cubicle open plan office where even the CEO sat in a cubicle, and that was at the time considered very egalitarian. All these companies were seen as innovative or new in that regard. But by the 90s, they thought the workers coming out of these places just thought that they were just empty, silly environments, and that these companies were also bureaucratic and monopolistic, etc. So once the kind of startup craze of that era started, surprisingly, a lot of the kind of .comers had a real interest in design, and so but they needed designs that were much more flexible, much more that could accommodate a company that had 20 people one day and then 60 people the next, because they had this new influx of venture capital. And so you have a lot of offices that reflect this kind of informality and speed, and that's where a lot of at the same time that they're also working insane hours because the pressure is enormous to make money and to sell their company to Microsoft or whatever their plan is, and so you have that's a lot of the kind of cult of informality, the foosball tables, the rec rooms, the lounge chairs. In a way, the office was designed to accommodate these bursts of frenetic activity, punctuated also by bursts of just frenetic gaming or frenetic just play, and for 16 hours a day. And the most famous example of this was maybe the nomadic office of Chiat Day, which was actually an ad firm in LA in the 90s, where the idea was that one no longer needed a desk of one's own because you had mobile technology, so you would just be given a computer, a laptop, given a mobile phone, and then asked to find a desk. And this was one of the first experiments of its kind. It failed pretty spectacularly because it was really imposed on the workers. They had no real say in it. But these were the kinds of experiments that took place in the 90s, and I think they really were reactions to the stable, career-oriented workplaces that a lot of these .com people had come out of.
I mean, on some level, it seems like it was just it has succeeded insofar as we now sort of seems to live in an age where we never really leave work. I mean, in some places, it's literal insofar as, like, you don't need to go out to a bar to play pool. We got the pool downstairs. We got the pool table downstairs. There's no reason for you to really leave here. And then you can come back after an hour, and we could spread out your workday over the course of 18 hours. And it's the same dynamic on some level, like with smartphone technology.
Yeah, I mean it's true. A lot of the kind of informality has bled out of has meant that the workplace isn't confined. I mean, work isn't confined to the office building, and so it's. On the other hand, the invert, the kind of correlate to this is the fact that the seeming air is just general informality, the fact that you can kind of work anywhere at any time, but that you have this sense of surveillance and discipline that you is either literal in the sense that someone is actually can watch you through various technologies while you work, or you just have internalized a sense of always need to be on the clock. So that was, I mean, in a way, I think people did want to break that down in the 90s. They did actually feel that that was somehow liberatory, to break down the 9-to-5 day and to blend leisure and work more seamlessly. But I mean, enough people now know from their own work lives that this is a very kind of busy, frenetic, exhausting way to live. So it's the kind of the cost of the liberation has been high.
Yeah, I mean, like because you write about the idea of sort of so many people have become freelancers now, and there's obviously different trade-offs involved in that. But if you were to write a couple more chapters, I guess 10, 15 years from now, would it be the story of how sort of we are cubed less physically and more, I guess, just sort of psychologically?
Existentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's always, the office design world is full of futurologists telling us what, is going to happen in the future. So I'm always hesitant to make those claims, but that seems like the safest prediction to make, the notion that the office is really not confined to the office building, and that it takes place all over the place, and in a way we already experience in our own lives that if you live in a city, you see that the cities are gradually trying to support office work no matter where they are. So universities sometimes open up spaces for office workers. Cafes, of course, have become informal offices. There are these places like co-working facilities where you pay for a desk to go to an office. And that corresponds to something else, which is the increasing casualization of labor. So which has been taking place over generations, but every study seems to confirm that there are more and more freelancers in the economy, more people who are independent contractors, people working on informal arrangements or contract arrangements, and those mean that you also are not part of a company with an office, or you have to find your own way to work. So those two things are happening. Another way to put that is that it's not just technology; it's the erosion over time of the old way that people used to work, the old sense of the contract between management and labor. So I think that's changed a lot as well, the way we work.
And do you think this disempowers, I guess, the worker in this context? I mean, I keep thinking about this story recently. It's not exactly on point, but it reminds me of just recently. There's been an attempt by Uber drivers to organize, but of course they have a tremendous amount of difficulty doing it because they're not in any way tethered to each other. I wonder if this doesn't, in some ways, sort of take it to the next level. There was some measure of isolation within the context of cubicles and some notion of hierarchy that kept people apart. Now it's just sort of literally, people are just sort of floating out there in the ether.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel that way. I think, there's a lot about this freelance economy, or the freelancing side of this economy, or the contract side that makes it much harder to organize. I mean, it at the same time that a lot of people seek, there is still that content of some sense of autonomy in one's work when you are a freelancer. At least there's a potential there. At the same time that you're still at the mercy of. It's not like there aren't large companies that are dictating what you do. You're still at the mercy of them. But maybe this is too optimistic. But I do feel that. I mean, there was a period, 100 years ago when the same discourse prevailed, the sense of atomization, anomie. I mean, the levels of unionization were about as low, and if you think about the conditions that workers faced, including, Pinkertons and things like that. I mean, just like real outright violence. What that was, at least for a while, that struggle seemed to be succeeding. So I think rather than sort of it probably seems likely that this is the future, the terrain on which people have to organize, the terrain on which people have to seek unions, rather than I don't think it's likely that we're going to turn back significantly in terms of how the subcontracting, and like not until some kind of way to organize comes about. It's definitely not. It's definitely hard, but I don't think it's impossible.
Hope springs eternal. Nikil Saval, the book is Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace. We'll put a link up at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.